The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like something dying, a sound Katie Rodriguez had learned to ignore 3 weeks ago when she'd walked through the doors of Seattle General for her first shift as night nurse. The smell hit her first, stale coffee mixed with antiseptic and something underneath it, something metallic that smelled like fear. The ICU was quiet at 11:11 p.m., the kind of quiet that only existed in hospitals, where machines breathed for people and monitors tracked the spaces between heartbeats. She moved through the hallway in her scrubs, navy blue, unmarked, generic, pushing a med cart with the deliberate precision of someone who had learned long ago that visibility got you killed. Her personnel file in the HR office downstairs said exactly what it needed to say: a registered nurse, civilian credentials, clean record, no complications. Nothing about Kandahar. Nothing about the 75th Ranger Regiment. Nothing about the 17 months she'd spent in a place where the dust got into everything and stayed there, coating your lungs, your teeth, your conscience. The cold stainless steel of the cart was smooth under her palms. Her hands bore the evidence of her real life in thin white scars that ran across the back of her knuckles, old marks, the kind that came from things she was no longer supposed to talk about. She'd learned to keep them out of sight by holding the cart handles a certain way, keeping her fingers curled inward during handoffs. Small accommodations for the life she'd chosen to live in the shadows. Night rounds, she said quietly to the charge nurse at the desk, a woman named Marshall who'd worked the ICU for 12 years and had perfected the art of not asking questions. Marshall nodded without looking up from the computer. This was the beauty of the night shift, people were too exhausted to be curious about the new hire. Katie moved through the bay checking vitals, reading monitors, noting the small changes that others missed. Room 4 had a patient whose creatinine was climbing toward acute kidney injury. Room 7's ventilator settings needed adjustment by at least 2 milliliters. These things she saw because she'd learned to see them in a war zone where a missed vital sign meant people died, and there were no second chances and no one came to collect the bodies if you got it wrong. Then the paramedics brought him in at 12:06 a.m. She heard the radio call first, a man's voice crackling through the overhead speaker calling out vitals with that practice monotone that meant the patient was stable enough to transport but sick enough to matter. Captain Marcus Webb, 34 years old, blunt force trauma to the left thorax, probable rib fractures, possible pneumothorax, alert and oriented ×3. The paramedics wheeled him in on a stretcher with the kind of controlled urgency that suggested they'd been running without lights. Katie was 2 rooms away when she saw him. His face was swollen on the left side, bruising already blooming purple and black across his jaw. His left arm lay across his chest in an unconscious protective gesture. But it was the dog tag, a single piece of metal on a chain with half the links broken, that made her stop moving. The tag hung at an angle from his neck, and even from a distance, even in the harsh light of the ICU bay, she could see the engraving. Webb, Marcus J. That wasn't why her hands went still. It was the next line down. Company B, 3rd Battalion. Danny's company. Danny's battalion. Danny had come home from Kandahar 3 years ago with stories about a captain who'd walked through a firefight in Sanjan Valley without flinching, who'd carried 2 wounded Rangers out on his own shoulders while rounds snapped past his head. Captain Webb. The man who'd kept her son alive through 3 tours because he was the kind of officer who didn't leave people behind. She forced her hands to move. Muscle memory took over, hands that had trained through 4 years at Johns Hopkins and 17 months in field medicine knew exactly what to do. She approached the stretcher, read the monitor strip, helped guide him into the ICU bed with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd never had the luxury of emotional reactions at work. Vital stable, one paramedic said, transferring the hand off to Dr. Michael Ashford, who'd materialized at the bedside with the sudden appearance of someone who'd been paged. Pulse 98, BP 118/72, O2 sat 94 on supplemental. Good lung sounds bilaterally. Ashford was a tall man with the kind of expensive posture that came from generations of private schools and country club lunches. He wore his stethoscope like a weapon and spoke with the measured tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He'd been at Seattle General for 7 years and had built a reputation as both brilliant and difficult, the kind of doctor who got excellent outcomes and left emotional wreckage in his wake. He made notes on Webb's chart while the ICU nurses worked the admission, starting and drawing labs, placing the cardiac monitor leads. Katie moved through the bay toward the supply area, needing space, needing to breathe, needing to process the fact that the first patient to matter to her in 3 weeks had just arrived on a stretcher with Danny's commanding officer's name engraved on his chest. She returned with the admission packet and the medication orders, and that's when she saw it. The chart notation for Webb's imaging was incomplete. A CT scan of the thorax had been ordered, but the results were listed as pending review. In the medication orders, she saw fentanyl listed at doses that seemed high for someone with stable vitals and no documented pain complaint, 120 micrograms every 4 hours, a schedule that would have kept him sedated for the next 12 hours. The timing was wrong. The dosing was wrong. The whole picture was wrong in a way that Katie's training recognized immediately. Pain was information. Every dose told a story about what the doctor believed was happening inside the patient's body. These doses told a story about someone who wanted the patient unconscious. She was still processing this, her eyes moving between the monitor strip and the medication orders, her brain cataloging the discrepancies, when Ashford's shadow fell across the bedside. She became aware of him the way prey becomes aware of a predator, not through any sudden movement but through a shift in air pressure, a change in the room's attention. His eyes moved from her face to the chart in her hands. The pause lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Nurse," he said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was the voice of a man accustomed to compliance. "I'll take those orders." She handed him the chart without comment. Her training had taught her that explaining yourself to someone in authority was a luxury for people who had nothing to hide. She'd been a major once, but that woman had been erased, officially removed from military records by order of people she'd never been allowed to name. That woman didn't exist anymore. The woman standing at this bedside was just a nurse, and just a nurse didn't question a doctor's medication orders. But Ashford was watching her with an intensity that suggested he'd noticed something. His gaze lingered on the chart, then returned to her face. His expression shifted, something calculated moved behind his eyes, the look of someone who'd noticed an inconsistency and was already running calculations about what it meant. "You've worked at Seattle General how long?" he asked. 3 weeks, she said. "And you've been assigned to Captain Webb's care already." "Random assignment, Doctor. I'm covering the ICU tonight." The lie was smooth because it was the truth. Random assignment had placed her here. Chance had brought Webb to this hospital. Coincidence had laid his dog tag on a broken chain directly across her line of sight. Ashford didn't believe in coincidence. Katie could see that in the tightness around his eyes. "I'll handle his medications personally," Ashford said. "Your role is monitoring and reporting vitals. Nothing more." "Understood." "Understood." She said it with the deference of someone who'd been trained in the language of subordination, the same way she'd learned to make herself small, to take up less space, to become the kind of person nobody noticed. But something in Ashford's expression suggested he'd already noticed too much. He turned back to the patient, and Katie moved through the bay with practiced efficiency, checking me for access, adjusting the cardiac leads, performing the 100 small tasks that kept a critical patient stable. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. But her mind was moving through the problem of Webb's medications like she was walking through a minefield, cataloging each piece of data, trying to understand what story the orders were telling. Webb's eyes opened briefly as she adjusted his monitor. For a moment, their gazes connected, his confused and medicated, hers carefully neutral. She saw the moment of recognition flicker across his face before the drugs pulled him back under. He'd met her exactly once, 3 years ago at a military family event in San Diego when Danny brought his commanding officer to a backyard barbecue. Webb would remember her as Danny's mother. As a civilian. As someone with no reason to be standing over his hospital bed at 12:38 a.m. The next morning, when the day shift arrived and Dr. Ashford made his rounds, Katie remained invisible, moving through the bay like she'd been trained to do, present but not present, competent but unremarkable. She checked Webb's medications and found they'd been given exactly as ordered. She reviewed his updated chart and found the CT results had finally been filed. The imaging showed rib fractures on the left side but nothing more significant, no pneumothorax, no hemothorax, nothing that required ongoing heavy sedation. She'd been working at Seattle General for 3 weeks. She'd been living in Jacksonville for exactly 2 years, renting a small apartment on the west side where no one asked questions and the neighbors kept to themselves. She'd been trying to be invisible for 7 years, ever since the military had erased her and told her the price of survival was never speaking about what she'd seen in Kandahar, never mentioning the case that had been dismissed, never surfacing from the grave they buried her in. And now Captain Marcus Webb lay sedated in the ICU, his medication orders written by a doctor who seemed to have reasons for keeping him unconscious that had nothing to do with his actual medical condition. The shift ended at 7:27 a.m. Katie handed off her patients to the day nurse and walked out to the parking garage with the same measured pace she used for everything, the pace of someone who'd learned that urgency attracted attention. She sat in her car, a 7-year-old Honda Civic with no distinguishing features, no bumper stickers, no personalization, and stared at the concrete wall in front of her. Whatever was happening to Captain Webb, she couldn't be involved. Her entire existence depended on staying invisible, on not drawing attention, on being the kind of person no one would ever think to look for. She'd built this life on the foundation of her erasure. She'd accepted the price of survival, which was the price of silence. But there was a dog tag on a broken chain, and attached to that tag was the name of a man who'd kept her son alive in a war zone. And there were medication orders that didn't make sense, and there was a doctor whose eyes had sharpened when he realized she'd been studying his work. The harbor of invisibility was about to become a very dangerous place. The reassignment started small. A schedule posted on the unit coordinator's desk, date circled in red pen, nothing that looked like sabotage at first glance. Katie's rotation shifted. She'd work ICU Monday through Wednesday, then jump to telemetry for 4 days, then swing back to post-op. The pattern was designed to be untraceable. No consistent patients. No time to follow anyone's trajectory. No opportunity to notice patterns in the medication orders. Dr. Ashford had been very deliberate. Katie saw it immediately because she'd planned logistics exactly like this once, in Kandahar, when she needed to separate a witness from testimony. Rotating assignments made people invisible to each other. Made follow-up impossible. Made it so no single person accumulated enough data to matter. She was setting sutures on a post-op patient at 3:22 a.m. when the intercom crackled overhead. Her name. Report to the unit manager's office. The other nurses exchanged looks, the kind that said they'd seen this play before, usually the beginning of the end. Katie tied off the last knot with her teeth and didn't rush. She took her time. Walked the corridor like she had nowhere else to be, past the break room where the fluorescent lights hummed their constant frequency, down the painted hallway with its motivational posters about teamwork that nobody believed in anymore. The unit manager's office was small. Ashford was already there, standing near the window like he owned the view of the empty parking lot below. The manager, a woman named Reynolds who'd worked at Seattle General for 17 years, sat behind her desk looking like she'd rather be anywhere else. A piece of paper sat in front of her, printed and official, the kind of document that changed trajectories. "We've received feedback about your performance," Reynolds said, and her voice had that careful tone of someone reading from a script someone else had written. "Some concerns about appropriate professional boundaries with patients." Katie didn't sit down. She stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides, absolutely still. Specifically, Ashford said, and now he smiled, just barely, the expression of a man who was about to deliver something he'd been savoring, your emotional involvement with patients. "It's affecting your judgment. You were staring at Captain Webb's chart for 12 minutes yesterday." 12 minutes. That's not clinical observation, Miss Rodriguez. That's fixation. The air in the office shifted. Katie registered the smell, Ashford's cologne, something expensive and thin, competing with the institutional bleach that seeped from the walls themselves. She took one measured breath. Her hands remained exactly where they were. "We're moving you to a rotating float assignment," Reynolds continued, sliding the paper forward. "For different units. This will help you maintain professional distance and expand your skill base. Ashford leaned against the windowsill. For different units means you'll never get 2 consecutive shifts on the same floor. Never build those attachments you seem prone to. It's really for the best, don't you think? Katie read the paper without touching it. The rotation was spelled out: ICU, then telemetry, then post-op, then the psychiatric wing, then back to ICU. Designed so she'd never have 48 hours with the same patient population. Designed so she'd never notice anything long enough to matter. She looked up, met Ashford's eyes, held them without flinching. "I understand," she said. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Ashford's smile faded just slightly. He'd expected something else, defensiveness, maybe, or an excuse. Not acceptance. Not that flat acknowledgement that said she understood exactly what he was doing and it changed nothing about her. She turned and left the office. But that wasn't the worst part. The write-up came 3 days later. It was posted on the unit board in the main break room, printed and laminated, the way hospitals announced important policy changes. A formal performance notation. Inappropriate emotional involvement with patients. Failure to maintain professional boundaries. Excessive focus on individual cases rather than unit-wide responsibilities. The words were carefully chosen, nothing that was technically false, nothing that a lawyer couldn't defend, everything that would make her look unstable to anyone reading it in isolation. Ashford had signed it at the bottom. His signature looked like a man was slowly drawing a blade across paper. Katie was pouring coffee when she noticed the shift in the room. The other nurses, Martinez, Chen, Jackson, all of them with 5 or more years at Seattle General, were gathered near the medication cart. They'd been laughing about something. The moment she walked in, they stopped. Gathered their lunches in a coordinated movement that might have been funny if it wasn't so clearly calculated. Stood up, one by one, and walked out. All of them. As if the room had become contaminated the moment she entered it. Chen was the last one. She was a good nurse, careful with her patients, the kind of person who didn't participate in hospital politics. But she stood up too, and she didn't make eye contact, and she left her half-eaten yogurt on the table like an accusation. 12 years of quiet work. 12 years of covering shifts when people were sick, of staying late when the unit was understaffed, of training new nurses who now wouldn't speak to her in hallways. And all of it reduced to the moment when people stopped wanting to sit in the same room. Katie sat down anyway. Opened her own lunch. A sandwich and some fruit. She ate slowly and methodically while her hands performed the task her mind had assigned them. The coffee cooled in her cup. The break room was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the hospital working around her. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She ate her sandwich and waited for the next crisis to arrive, because in her experience, there was always a next crisis. You just had to be patient enough to see it coming. It came in the form of Ashford's shadow across the break room threshold. He stood there at 4:53 a.m. on her 7th rotating shift, when she was assigned to psychiatric observation and barely knew the unit layout. He wore his white coat over scrubs that probably cost more than Katie's monthly rent, and he held a folder against his chest like he was delivering something precious. A word, Miss Rodriguez. Not a request. A summons. She followed him to a small conference room that smelled like stale coffee and the previous hour's discussion about insurance codes. He sat down and gestured for her to do the same. The transfer to the psychiatric wing, he said, is being made permanent. Effective immediately. It's for your own good, actually. You clearly have some unresolved trauma from your nursing career. You seem fixated on patients in ways that aren't healthy. The psychiatric unit is quieter. Fewer acute cases. Might give you some time to process whatever's happening. The folder opened. More paperwork. More official documentation. The transfer was already approved by someone with more institutional authority than Ashford technically had, which meant he'd made calls to people who owed him favors. This was stage 2 of the rotation, isolate her completely, move her far enough away that she'd have no access to Webb or any patient she might have been monitoring. Katie took one measured breath. She held that breath for exactly 4 seconds. She let it out slowly, the way they'd taught her at Walter Reed, the way they'd trained her to stay calm when everything around her was burning. One tear escaped. Just one. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. "I wonder," she said, her voice absolutely steady, her words measured and precise, "what the State Board would find interesting about Captain Webb's fentanyl logs." The silence that followed was the kind that predators understand immediately. Ashford's face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with the fluorescent lighting. His jaw tightened. His hand, the one holding the folder, began to tremble very slightly. Katie stood up. "I'm going on break," she said. She walked out of the conference room before he could respond, before he could recover, before he could weaponize any other institutional tool he had at his disposal. She walked past the break room where the other nurses still wouldn't sit near her. Past the medication cart. Past the monitoring stations where people moved in quiet efficiency, doing what they'd been trained to do, which was to survive in systems that often had nothing to do with actual medicine. And she didn't know, as she gathered her things from the locker room, a jacket that had seen better decades, a phone with a cracked screen, that 3 hours from now, the real nightmare would begin. The alarm started as a scream. 3 monitors erupted in synchronized chaos, and Katie's head snapped up from the medication cart where she'd been methodically documenting her final shift before the transfer to psychiatric. The sound bypassed her conscious mind entirely. 11 years of instinct took over. She moved toward ICU Bay 4 before she'd finished the thought. Captain Webb's chest heaved in shallow, desperate gasps. His oxygen saturation was plummeting. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, laboring against something it couldn't fix, and his blood pressure had collapsed to numbers that didn't support human consciousness. His lips had taken on the grayish tint of someone whose blood was no longer reaching the periphery. 2 residents stood frozen on either side of the bed, their hands trembling above the patient, eyes darting between the monitors and each other like animals caught in headlights. They knew what needed to happen. They'd learned the protocol in medical school, drilled it in simulation labs with plastic mannequins that bled nothing and died nothing and never asked them to crack open a human chest. Decompensating, one of them whispered, as if stating the problem was the same as solving it. Katie's eyes moved across Webb's chest, reading the clinical story written in the configuration of his ribcage, the angle of his breathing, the way his heart rate was climbing but his blood pressure was dying. Cardiac tamponade. A penetrating fragment lodged near the heart, compressing the chambers, and Ashford's deliberately incomplete imaging had missed it completely. The man had ordered a chest X-ray instead of a CT. Had ordered it at a specific angle. Katie had seen those orders now, had traced the sequence, and understood that some oversights were deliberate. "Someone get Dr. Ashford," one resident said, but his voice carried the false hope of someone praying to a god he didn't believe in. Katie's hand was already in her locker, fingers closing around the handle of the knife she'd carried out of Kandahar 14 years ago. A Benchmade Adamas, the blade darkened by use and time, balanced for one hand in the dark. She'd kept it against regulations, against every protocol, because some habits the body refused to unlearn. Some tools you couldn't replicate with institutional equipment. She crossed to the bedside in 4 strides. Her movements had changed. The hesitant shuffle of the new night nurse vanished. Her shoulders squared. Her voice dropped 2 octaves. "Scalpel won't cut through the ribcage fast enough," she said, not to the residents but simply as a statement of fact. "Get me the rapid infuser. 2 units of O negative. Now." "Who authorized?" one resident started. "Authorization stands," Katie said. Chest opening left anterolateral. 4th intercostal space. "Move." The knife came out of its sheath with a whisper. The residents watched her hands. That was always the tell. Katie's hands moved with the economy of motion that came only from repetition in actual crisis, not simulation. No hesitation. No tremor. The blade made a smooth incision through skin and fascia, and she felt the familiar resistance as steel met rib. The sound was something between a click and a cut, and the smell that rose was copper and something else, something deeper, the iron smell of a body compromised. The second incision went between the ribs. Blood flowed, and she didn't wipe it. Couldn't afford the cognitive load. The hiss of air escaping as she opened the pericardium came like a small gasp, and suddenly his blood pressure climbed. 58. 62. 70. Sinus rhythm, she said, and her hands were already moving, finding the heart chamber, the pressure point, the exact spot where human architecture could be rebooted by someone who understood that pain was information and information was survival. She massaged the ventricle. Once. Twice. The monitors began to respond. 74. 81. 88. Dr. Ashford appeared in the doorway in time to see her hand inside Captain Webb's chest, in time to see the monitors climbing like a ladder, in time to understand that whatever he'd done through strategic negligence and deliberate misdirection had just been corrected by someone who shouldn't have known how. His face went white. Not with awe. With the specific shade of white that comes when a man realizes he's been exposed. Katie didn't look at him. She was focused on the numbers, on the breathing, on the slight flutter of the organ beneath her fingers that meant this part was working. The residents had scrambled to get the blood, the fluids, the medication she'd asked for in a voice they recognized as command, even though nothing in her credentials suggested she'd ever given one. "Get a surgical team down here," she said quietly. "He needs a thoracotomy in an OR. This is field stabilization only. Move." Someone ran. Ashford still stood in the doorway, mouth open, watching the numbers stabilize. 92% oxygen saturation. Blood pressure holding at 118/76. A rhythm that was steady enough to move him upstairs. Katie withdrew her hands. "Step back. Let the moment settle into the room like ash." "Pressure dressing," she said to the nearest resident, her voice back to its normal register now but carrying the weight of something else entirely. "Sterile gauze. 8x8. Apply direct pressure while we move him." She turned to the sink. The water ran hot, and she washed Webb's blood from her hands with the same methodical precision she'd used to save his life, watching it spiral down the drain in red rivulets. The combat knife was still on the Mayo stand. Nobody had touched it. Nobody had asked where it came from. Dr. Ashford had already disappeared. Making phone calls, probably. To his brother-in-law who practiced law. To the hospital board. To anyone who might help him bury what he'd just witnessed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd just blown her cover to pieces. She'd performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife in an American hospital in Jacksonville, Florida, using terminology and technique that could only come from one place, one training, one identity that was supposed to stay erased. And 3 residents had watched her hands move. Had heard her voice drop into military command. Had seen the precision that no civilian nurse carried. Security arrived 7 minutes later. They didn't say her name. Just escorted her out with quiet efficiency while the hospital around her began to spin into motion, surgeons being called, Webb being moved upstairs, monitors being transferred, the machinery of institutional medicine taking over what her hands had begun. Katie sat in her car in the parking garage, engine dead, head pressed against the steering wheel, unable to move. The smell of blood was still on her, even though she'd washed. Some smells don't leave. They live in the fibers of your scrubs, in your hair, under your fingernails. The smell of keeping someone alive. She had 37 minutes before the Pentagon got the call. Maybe longer. Maybe less. The residents would tell someone. Security would file a report. Someone would notice the knife, photograph it, trace it. And then the machinery that had made her disappear 14 years ago would spring to life again to finish the job. She'd saved her son's commanding officer. She'd broken every rule written to keep her invisible. And now both the military that had erased her and the man in the building who'd tried to destroy her would come for what was left. Ashford's hand shook as he dialed. 3 calls in rapid succession, the hospital board chairman, his attorney cousin in Seattle, the risk management director who owed him favors from a malpractice settlement years back. His voice came out sharp, clipped, each word chosen to plant doubt before questions could form. We have a serious protocol violation in the ICU. A night nurse performed an unauthorized surgical procedure on a patient with a knife. I have witnesses. I need legal counsel immediately. The lies wove between the truths like silk through concrete. She'd acted without attending physician approval. She'd endangered the patient. She'd created massive liability. He didn't mention that the patient was alive because of what her hands had done. He didn't mention the incomplete imaging or the missed fragment or the fentanyl orders that had been written in doses designed to keep Webb unconscious, compliant, unable to testify about what he'd seen in Kandahar. Ashford paced his office, his Rolex catching the fluorescent light as he gestured at nothing, rehearsing the narrative. By the time security arrived to escort Katie out, the story was already spreading through the administrative channels like contamination through a wound. Security came at 6:06 a.m. Two officers in Navy uniforms, their radios crackling softly at their hips. They didn't meet her eyes. Dr. Ashford's orders. You're to clear your locker and leave the premises immediately. You're not to return to the ICU or contact any staff members. Katie set down her tablet, the one displaying Webb's most recent vitals, the sinus rhythm she'd fought to restore ticking steadily on the monitor, and nodded once. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She removed her badge and set it on the desk beside the tablet. The plastic lanyard fell across the edge like a surrendered weapon. Through the ICU doors, she could see Ashford in Webb's room, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing frantically while a surgical resident looked pale and confused beside the bed. The resident was young, maybe 26, and Katie recognized the look on her face, the look of someone who'd just realized her mentor was capable of something darker than simple arrogance. The parking garage was empty at this hour, the concrete floor reflecting sodium lights like a shallow grave. Her car sat where she'd left it 12 hours earlier, the nurse's lot reserved space C-147. Jacksonville's heat was already climbing, even at dawn, and the windshield was warm under her palms. She sat in the driver's seat with the door open, feet on the pavement, unable to find the muscle memory for what came next. The key hung in her hand. She didn't turn the engine. The dog tag hung around her neck under her scrubs, the one she'd worn for 14 years, the one that had been inside an envelope marked "Never Remove" when they'd briefed her on the erasure protocol. It had belonged to a soldier she'd saved in Kandahar. Now it belonged to no one. She'd just revealed her existence to a room full of hospital staff. She'd performed a combat surgical technique that only someone with her specific training would recognize. She'd used a knife that had seen battlefields. The chalk line was erased. The cover was broken. And inside Seattle General, Dr. Ashford was already making the phone calls that would ensure neither the hospital nor the Pentagon would allow her to exist in either world. Her hand shook. Not from fear. From restraint. From the understanding that if she let go, truly let go, she would break something that couldn't be repaired. She'd spent 14 years learning how to disappear into a civilian life. How to be just a night nurse. How to make her hands forget what they knew how to do. 3 hours of saving Webb's life had unraveled it all. The blade went in at the fourth intercostal space. The blade came out. The hiss of the pneumothorax releasing. Sinus rhythm on the monitor. All of it was documentation. All of it was evidence. All of it was a violation of the classified operation agreement that had erased her from every official record the moment she'd testified against General Morrison's son for what he'd done in San Juan Valley. She'd been Major Catherine Elena Rodriguez, 75th Ranger Regiment, JSOC attached, decorated for 7 operations across 3 continents. Then she'd reported the war crime. Then the court-martial had been administratively concluded when Morrison Sr. pulled strings that reached the Joint Chiefs. Then she'd been offered a choice, disappear voluntarily or be disappeared by people who did it with less ceremony. The hospital where she'd trained in trauma surgery, gone. The military records, sanitized. Her rank erased. Her medals locked in a vault she could never access. They'd given her new Social Security paperwork, a nursing license, and an address in Jacksonville with enough cash to survive until she found work. They'd told her that if she ever surfaced, if she ever revealed her identity, the Pentagon would deny her existence and prosecute her for theft of classified materials, breach of national security, and unauthorized practice of military medicine. They'd been very clear about that last one. She was not a doctor. She was not allowed to operate. She was not permitted to save lives using anything but the civilian nursing protocol she'd been given. But she'd saved Webb anyway. The rain started without warning, hammering the windshield so hard the drops sounded like shrapnel. Katie sat with her head against the steering wheel, the dog tag pressing into her sternum, the one that said Danny's commander had lived through 3 tours because she'd kept him alive in Kandahar. She'd broken 14 years of invisibility to save the man who'd saved her son. And now the military that had erased her would come. Ashford would destroy what little remained. And somewhere in a Pentagon building, someone was reading the incident report and realizing that the nurse who'd performed an unauthorized thoracotomy at 3:22 a.m. in Jacksonville, Florida, had performed it with the precision of someone who'd done it before. Someone who'd been trained for exactly this. Someone who wasn't supposed to exist. Her phone buzzed at 5:13 a.m. Then again. Then a third time. Calls from numbers she didn't recognize. A voicemail from a hospital administrator she'd never met. A text from an unknown sender that read simply, "Stand by." She didn't listen to the messages. She turned the phone face down on the passenger seat and closed her eyes. The rain kept coming. The dog tag kept pressing. The windshield kept hammering. She was 42 years old, alone in a parking garage in a city that had never known her real name, holding onto a dead soldier's tag and waiting for the people who'd erased her to come finish the job. She reached for the tag, her fingers closing around the metal, and for a moment, just a moment, she considered throwing it out the window. Letting it disappear into the storm. Becoming completely invisible. Becoming nothing. Then she heard it. A sound that didn't belong to Jacksonville's dawn. A distant thumping. Rhythmic. Growing closer. The rotor blade signature of a military aircraft cutting through the rain. The rotor blades cut through the dawn like surgical steel. Katie sat in the parking garage, still in her scrubs, when the sound grew so loud the concrete walls vibrated. Not a commercial chopper. The signature was wrong, deeper, military grade, the acoustic signature of a UH-60M Black Hawk. Her hands went steady. Years of training recognizing approach patterns. Not police. Not medevac. This was 160th SAW caliber, the Night Stalkers, and they were landing in the parking lot of Seattle General. She didn't move. She couldn't move. The engine of her car was dead, had been dead for 3 hours, since the moment security had escorted her out while Captain Webb was being wheeled into emergency surgery. The surgery Ashford had ordered despite the telltale signs, the penetrating trauma, the muffled heartbeat, the tamponade that should have been obvious to anyone paying attention. But Ashford had been too busy erasing her file, too busy making calls to board members, too busy protecting a cover-up to notice that the man Katie had saved was already circling the drain again. The rotor wash shook the entire parking structure. Dust devils spun between the concrete pillars. Katie saw them from her windshield, 2 soldiers in full Class A dress uniform, the kind you wore to ceremonies or funerals, stepping out of the hospital entrance. Army Rangers. The insignia on their shoulders caught the early morning light like a warning. They were asking for her. She could hear it through the concrete, through the parking garage walls, that particular military precision of command voice cutting through the civilian morning noise. Not a request. Not a question. The kind of voice that moved mountains because it had already moved men. Katie's hand started to move without permission, fingers finding the door handle like muscle memory from another life. The moment her boots hit the garage floor, her phone buzzed. A text from a number with no name, Major Rodriguez. Confirm visual on Black Hawk. Stand by for extraction. Extraction. Not a social call. Not a courtesy visit. Someone had moved heaven and earth in the last 3 hours, and now the military was here not to observe but to intervene. Katie climbed the stairs from the parking garage instead of taking the elevator. 7 flights. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears by the 3rd floor, and it wasn't fear. It was recognition. After 14 years of disappearance, of being officially non-existent, of pushing a med cart through fluorescent-lit hallways while her entire service record was locked in a vault somewhere at the Pentagon, someone had finally said her name. The ICU doors opened as she reached them. The nursing staff froze. Katie moved past them like the air had cleared a path, like gravity had shifted, and she was walking downslope now whether she wanted to or not. The 2 Rangers stood flanking Captain Webb's room. Their eyes tracked her approach with the kind of focus that made civilians nervous. Katie had lived in that focus long enough to be comfortable in it. Danny stood up from the bedside chair the moment he saw her. Her son, 28 years old, wearing the same Class A uniform as the Rangers, his hands shaking as he crossed the room. His voice broke on the second word, the composure of a commissioned officer fracturing like ice under pressure. "Mom, Major, Captain Webb is awake," and he told them everything. The room went still. Not the polite silence of a hospital. The heavy silence of classified material being said aloud in a space where it was never supposed to be spoken. Katie's eyes moved past her son to the wheelchair position beside the hospital bed, Captain Marcus Webb, still bandaged but conscious, holding a manila file with both hands as if it weighed more than paper had any right to. Webb's voice came out rough from the anesthesia, from the trauma, from the weight of 14-year-old secrets finally being given oxygen. There was a field surgeon in Kandahar. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines Dark Horse. She saved 15 men that I know of. Pulled fragmentation from my abdomen with her hands. No surgical tools. Just hands and training and something that looked like rage. He paused, breathing through the pain, his eyes finding Katie's. They buried her for testifying about a general's son. War crimes. The case was dismissed and they erased her. Made her disappear. Took her rank, her service record, everything. She was ordered to become a ghost and stay a ghost. A voice cut through from the hallway. Older, carrying the weight of command, and Katie's body recognized it before her brain caught up. A Navy SEAL commander, someone she'd trained within 3 operations across 4 continents, stepped into the ICU room with his uniform immaculate and his eyes locked on Katie like a weapon systems lock. His presence made the air pressure change. 2 silver stars, the commander said. His voice moved through the gathered staff like a defibrillator through cardiac arrest. Bronze star with Valor. Distinguished Service Cross. With each medal, the crowd of nurses and residents drew closer, their phones slowly disappearing into pockets, the weight of what they were hearing beginning to register on their faces. Katie remained motionless. She had learned long ago that movement during revelation only distracted from the truth. "That's the surgical record from Kandahar," the commander continued. 15 Rangers saved. 3 of them standing in this room right now. One of them is a civilian flight surgeon who watched Major Rodriguez perform an open cardiac massage on a man already dead by every medical standard. She kept him alive through the dust-off. Kept him alive for 6 hours until she could get him to a facility with a blood bank. He paused, letting that land. The order to erase her came from the Pentagon on a classified channel. The reason? She refused to stay silent when command asked her to. That was the moment Ashford tried to back toward the stairwell. He didn't run. Men like Ashford never ran from the moment directly. They edged away, maintained the pretense of dignity, believed that if they could just reach the elevator they could descend into the bureaucracy and disappear the way bureaucracies allowed men to disappear. He made it exactly 3 steps before the FBI agent stepped out of the stairwell in dress shoes and dark jackets, their badges reflecting the fluorescent hospital lights like mirrors. "Dr. Robert Ashford?" The agent's voice was flat. "Federal." Ashford's face drained. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had turned a spigot. "I'm not sure what this is about, but I have rights. I want my attorney." "You're about to want a lot of things," the agent said. "We have you on 3 separate instances of altering Captain Webb's medication records. Fentanyl dosages increased beyond therapeutic range. Pain management orders forged with falsified physician signatures." The agent stepped closer. "We have emails where you instructed a records clerk to expedite Major Rodriguez's transfer paperwork and mark her file for disciplinary review. We have a draft document on your personal computer, still warm from recent access, attempting to forge her original personnel file. Rewriting her service history. Making it look like she had a civilian nursing degree and nothing else." Ashford's mouth opened. Closed. The sound of a man running through mental escape routes and finding them all blocked off by federal jurisdiction. "You were covering up the Friendly Fire incident," the agent continued. "Captain Webb witnessed it. Command wanted it buried. You were asked, by whom, will determine, to keep him medicated and compliant so he wouldn't start asking questions about his own treatment. A tactical administrative solution to a problem that should have been reported." The handcuffs came out. Not gently. The metal made that particular sound as they clicked around Ashford's wrists, the noise of institutional collapse, of a career becoming a single moment of miscalculation. He started screaming about his reputation, about his credentials, about the injustice of bureaucratic overreach, and the agents walked him past the break room where 12 nurses had sat down together for lunch 6 hours earlier and left the moment Katie had taken a seat beside them. Those same 12 nurses watched from their table as Dr. Robert Ashford was escorted past in handcuffs, his voice cracking on accusations of unfairness, his hands shaking hard enough that the cuffs caught the light. One nurse made eye contact with Katie. Just for a moment. Just long enough to convey the entire architecture of regret. By noon, Katie's phone had buzzed for more times. A message from the Pentagon. A message from the Secretary of the Army. A message marked urgent from someone she'd never heard of but whose authorization code suggested they worked directly from the executive office building. The last message was an invitation on letterhead so formal it required 3 creases to fit in an envelope. It was a presidential invitation to a ceremony. Reinstatement of rank. Honoring of service. Recognition of the 15 Rangers she'd saved, 15 men who would have remained in Arlington Cemetery instead of walking out of a hospital if a nurse named Katie Rodriguez hadn't been willing to break her cover. That evening, Danny helped her fasten her uniform. The dress blues hung on her frame like a memory of a different woman, though she was the same woman who had worn them into the desert 14 years ago. Danny's hands shook as he positioned the oak leaves, Major's insignia, on her shoulders. His fingers caught for just a moment on the fabric, not out of clumsiness but out of the weight of finally being allowed to acknowledge what his mother actually was. "I'm proud of you," Danny said. "I've always been proud of you. But now everyone else gets to be." Katie turned to the mirror. The woman looking back was still wearing scrubs underneath a dress uniform jacket, old habit, never fully dressed unless she was ready to work. The reflection stared at her with eyes that had seen Kandahar, had witnessed corruption at the command level, had chosen integrity over survival, had then spent 14 years quietly healing people who would never know her name. In the basement of Seattle General, Dr. Robert Ashford clocked in for his first shift as night security guard. His name tag read Robert in a plain font. His job was to check doors, verify locks, walk the corridors while the hospital slept. The same corridors where he had been chief of surgery. The same hallways where he had bullied a decorated combat surgeon because she knew too much. He watched the security monitors in the break room. He saw Katie in her major's dress uniform, Danny walking beside her to the helicopter that was landing one more time in the parking lot. He saw the entire hospital staff step outside to watch her board. He saw the Black Hawk rise into the morning light and carry her toward a ceremony where the President of the United States would acknowledge that she had been right all along. And Robert Ashford locked a door that he no longer had authority to open. Checked a clipboard with his name printed wrong. Walked a corridor where he would never be called doctor again. The trembling in his hands had nothing to do with fear. It was the physical manifestation of being forced to understand, finally and irrevocably, that some people are capable of surviving erasure because they were never erasable. Katie Rodriguez sat in the helicopter as it crossed the Potomac, the dog tag on the broken chain still around her neck, gleaming in the morning light. Webb had given it to her before she boarded, the one she'd been wearing the day she testified, the one that proved she existed. The one that proved she had always been Major. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. Would you have testified, knowing the cost? Or would you have stayed silent to keep your life intact? Comment below and let us know where your line is drawn. Subscribe for more stories of people who refuse to disappear.